Spanish for any radio station to take is over 250 are. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. The history of Latinos in New York is the focus of a new exhibit at El Museo del Barrio in Spanish Harlem. The exhibition looks at the relationship between New York City and the Spanish-speaking world from 1613 to the end of World War II. To accompany the exhibit, the award-winning filmmaker Rick Burns has directed a short documentary called Nueva York. The film begins with an interview with our very own Juan Gonzalez.
Well, I think the great Irish migrations of the 1840s and the Italians in the late 1800s and the early 1900s into New York, that was a migration of 20, 30, 40 years. The Latino migration, especially into New York City, beginning with Puerto Ricans, is going to continue till the end of this century. It's going to be a migration probably of 150 years in terms of length. People don't even really grasp yet, I don't think, the enormous demographic transformation that's occurring, but it's entirely possible that the entire United States, by the end of this century, the majority of the people will trace their origin to Latin America. So you're seeing basically the total demographic transformation of the nation, and in many ways the Puerto Rican migration into New York was the sign of what was to come and what has continued to occur, not just in New York, but throughout the country.
An excerpt from the documentary Nueva York by Rick Burns, and that again was Juan Gonzalez, co-host of Democracy Now! Joining us now, Mike Wallace, professor of history at City University of New York, worked as a chief historian for the Nueva York exhibit at El Museo del Barrio. Mike Wallace is co-author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book Gotham, A History of New York City to 1898. Talk about the significance of this exhibit and what you're trying to capture.
Usually the history of New York City and to some extent of the United States is told as an East-West phenomena. It looks at Europe, it looks at Africa, and it looks at the North American continent. People know that there's this other story in the South, but it's peripheral. You see it out of the corner of your eye. What we tried to do in this exhibit is to turn the angle of attention 90 degrees and to privilege the relations with the Spanish-speaking world. And when you do that, you discover that there's a whole other narrative. It's not that it's more or less important than the East-West, but it's a critical supplement to it. So the whole city and the whole country, to some degree, looks different when you understand that story.
And I was fascinated, Mike, when I finally got a chance to see the exhibition that you've been talking to me about for years and working on, is the richness of that early Latino influence in New York, going back to you came across the documents for Juan Rodriguez, who
yes, there was a Jan Rodriguez who was called by the Dutch mulatto from Santo Domingo, and he was set ashore in 1613 and spent a year there, basically trading with Lenni Lenape, and in effect became the first settler of non-indigenous background.
In what is now New York.
In what is now New York, in Manhattan, it seems to be the case. Yeah.
But then you trace also the enormous importance of Latin America in the prosperity and the development and the trade of New York as well.
The remarkable thing is that, on the one hand, there were virtually no Spanish people in New York for the first 150 years. This was a Dutch colony. The Dutch hated the Spanish. They hated Catholics. They didn't want them in town. English take over, it's the same deal for another 100 years. But at the same time, the Dutch and the English are deeply involved with the Spanish-speaking world. Partly trade, they're supplying the slaves to the Spanish Empire, and partly war. They're fighting them all the time and stealing their treasure ships and all the rest of it. So it's only with the revolution when the United States becomes independent of the British Empire, and with the wars of liberation of Spanish America, which are what are being now having their bicentennial celebrations, that a connection is made between them, and a tremendous amount of commerce begins to flow, critically around sugar, which is the other story. We usually think of cotton as the key, force of the 19th century. And so New York ships go down to Cuba, to Puerto Rico, still in the Spanish Empire. They go to Mexico, they go to South America. They bring back commodities that are processed here. New York becomes the biggest sugar refining operation in the country. Manufacturers are spurred to sell down to Latin America. Spanish-speaking books are printed here. Spanish currency is printed here. So there's a tremendous flow back and forth, and the money that comes out of the sugar trade goes into other things. So Moses Taylor, one of the richest merchants in the sugar trade, becomes the president of Citibank, which is the ancestor of today's Citicorp. And then the money from the sugar trade flows into transportation, infrastructure, and the rest of it. And those same connections that are struck, in fact, they're the kind of metaphorical bridges across which now Spanish people begin to come. So the two first communities in New York are critically Cubans on the one hand, and Spaniards from Spain on the other hand. The latter are agents of Spanish merchant shipping. The Cubans are Cuban planters and Cuban merchants. But in that wave, starting in the 1810s and the 1820s, come rebels against the empire, because in fact Cuba and Puerto Rico are still inside the empire, and New York becomes a staging ground for a whole series throughout the rest of the century of assaults or efforts to buy or somehow to incorporate Cuba in the United States or to liberate it. And in the early days, in fact, they make their peace with slavery. I mean, the reason that Cuba and Puerto Rico are so rich and prosperous for sugar is because, in fact, they keep slavery. When Haiti had the revolution and the English gave up slavery. So the early years, they want to, in fact, support slavery because, in fact, their profits are tied to that. By the 1880s and 1890s, when Jose Marti comes to town, and his base are the cigar makers and cigar rollers in New York City, there's a dramatic shift towards complete independence. And the Spanish-Cuban-American War, which is launched from New York City and largely backed by the press and business elements in New York City, is largely run out of New York. And in 1898, New York sees itself now as the potential center of a new Latin American empire.
We're talking to Mike Wallace, and he really has curated this exhibit at El Museo del Barrio. Now, you look at before 1945. Rick Burns' film looks post-45, but I want to go to another excerpt from Rick Burns' Nueva York. This is Robert Courtney Smith, author of the book Mexican New York.
We're back now to having this very cosmopolitan city. You're getting tremendous demographic change. In 1980, there were about 40,000 Mexicans in New York City. Today, there are about 500,000. So in the space of 30 years, you've gone more than tenfold in terms of an increase. In grammar schools here, you've got 50, 60, 70%